I'm here because I believe that it is so important for our society as a whole and for each of us individually to know about one another religiously, to have what they call some baseline religious literacy. Our religions shape our identities, our practices, our weekly schedules, our friends, our politics, our relationship to the earth and to one another. And so if we want to get along in what Martin Luther King Jr. has called the world house that we live in, then we're going to have to know something about the people that we're living with. So that's my motivation for being with you today, to help to increase our religious literacy. So there are, of course, both similarities and differences among religious traditions. And in general, I'm going to say that most people tend to overemphasize one or the other. Either we want to say that all the religious traditions are basically teaching the same thing, or we want to say that religious traditions are so different we can't even talk to each other. So today I want to highlight both our similarities and our differences in what I see as a big human family with many ways of being religious in the world. So during our time today, I'm going to draw heavily on the work of Stephen Prothero. This book is called God Is Not One. And one of his arguments, which you might be able to gather from the title of the book, is that all of the world's religions are not essentially the same. When we look at various religions, it's important to notice the ways that we're not just talking about different paths up the same mountain or touching different parts of the one elephant or whatever metaphor you may have heard for relating to different religions. Prothero argues that those who claim that all religions are essentially the same, they do so with good intentions. They want to combat religious intolerance and war, and they want to reject exclusive claims to heaven or paradise or whatever it might be. But Prothero argues that this is a dangerous idea because it can keep us from seeing and foreseeing the ways that religious conflict has existed and will continue to exist in the future. Prothero also argues that claiming that all religions are essentially the same is disrespectful because the differences between our religions matter to religious people. So ignoring those differences can be disrespectful, and those differences have real implications in the world. And so people like this guy, Hans Kung, he's a Christian theologian, he said, "It would be impossible to find anywhere in the world a sincere Jew, Muslim, or atheist who would not regard the assertion that he is an anonymous Christian as presumptuous." So Kung is responding to an argument by Karl Rahner, a Catholic Christian theologian, who argued that people can be Christian without knowing they're Christian. Anonymous Christian. You know, if you do the things Christ would have done, then you can be an anonymous Christian. So the same discomfort or outrage at such a claim would likely also go for those who want to say that even though someone's not a Jew, for instance, they're essentially Jewish because they love their God and they love neighbor. Or you can imagine someone being not so happy if someone said that, "Oh, you're Muslim because you're so humble." Well, that's not what makes someone a Muslim in totality. Come on in. Hi. These claims would ruffle some feathers. Come on in. Welcome. So finally, Prothero argues that this idea that religious traditions are essentially the same is simply untrue. We need a realistic view of where religious people clash and where they can cooperate. So Swami Sivananda, I'm going to butcher some of these pronunciations, so please forgive me in advance. He says, we have heard it said that the fundamentals or essentials of all religions are the same, and there is difference only in the non-essentials. This is a lovely sentiment, but it is dangerous, disrespectful, and untrue. And so in his book, God is Not One, Prothero offers us a handy tool that we're going to use today to learn about religions. He says that there's something that each religion has in common, and that is that each religion has an observation about the world, and each religion has questions and answers about the human condition. So each religion states that there's a problem. There's something wrong with the world. Each religion provides a solution of some kind, and they also provide a technique or a method to get to the solution. And then they have exemplars who sort of chart the path to the solution. So each religion differs, of course, in how they identify and explain those problems, solutions, techniques, and exemplars. Some of our assessments of the human condition today will look similar, simply because we're all human. In addition, religious traditions build on one another, and they critique one another. So our religious traditions are different, but they also have similarities. So that's sort of the philosophical approach that I'm taking as we look at these religions, and I encourage you to look at the similarities and the differences and not be afraid of either one. Okay, so I thought it would be good. This is a messy little map here, as you can see. But as we move from our introductory comments to now the content of the religious traditions we're going to talk about, I want to show you 5 basic religious families, and we can group them according to region. So we have those that originated in India and the surrounding areas. So those are going to be Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Sikhism draws on Hinduism, and then we also have Baha'i there, which ended up over here, but it's in the region. We also have the religions that arose in China, including Confucianism and Taoism. We have the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We also have Celtic and Greco-Roman religions in the north. We sometimes forget about those. And then we have African religions in the south. I put Yoruba there, but there's a lot of indigenous African religious traditions. Yoruba is just a well-known one. So what we see on this map is that religion is a human phenomenon. People groups all over the world have cultures and traditions by which they make meaning out of the world and their experience, and we find different religions in different areas of the world. And of course, now we live in a very global society, so we're all mixing and matching, but noticing those regions can be important. We can also get an overview by looking at religious families over time. So this timeline comes from Oxford Reference. The times that you'll see in various timelines are all different because it's based on what evidence they're using, but this is one. So Egyptian religion, Babylonian religion, Celtic, Judaism, ancient roots of Hinduism, Confucianism, Greco-Roman, Zoroastrianism, Jainism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, Islam, and Sikhism. So you can see how they move from oldest to youngest. And so we see that religions are developing at different time periods and in different places. We might notice then in what we talk about in just a few moments, what comes before and what comes after. Since religious traditions are always set in a context, they're always responding to what has come before, and they are usually offering something just a little bit different. Okay, so we are only going to talk about 5 world religions. We're not going to hit all of those that were on the map and the timeline in just 90 minutes. We'll talk about Hinduism and Buddhism, and then the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The religions that we will not cover today are also very important, but I've chosen these because they have the most adherents or they've had a really big influence. In the short time that we have today, we're not going to be able to do these religions justice, but for each religion, I'll try to offer you some basic facts and then a bit of their history and the various branches within that religion. And we'll use that tool that Prothero gave us, the human problem, the solution, the technique, and the exemplars. I am going to give you a chart at the very end, which has a lot of those quick facts and similarities and differences written here with the problem, solution, exemplars, all that stuff. So hopefully after today, if you take this with you, you'll sort of know what it means. But if I gave it to you now, you might be confused by it. So please don't forget to take one of those at the end. We're going to also have 5 minutes between each religion. So each presentation of a religion is about 10 minutes. Then we're going to have 5 minutes where I'm going to ask you to talk to your neighbors so that you can respond to each religion. You won't have to say anything to the big group. It's nothing to put you on the spot, but just a little break. And if you do need to take that time to use the restroom or whatever, then you know that those breaks are built in. But it'll be 5 minutes after every 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, we start. We start with Hinduism. Hindu is an umbrella term that was created by non-Indians for the religious tradition that gave us karma and reincarnation and yoga. And it has its early history in the Indus Valley civilization. So you can see that that's where Hindu came from, Indus Valley. In Sanskrit, the word that is used for this tradition is Sanatan Dharma, which means the eternal truth of life. And so some Hindus are actually, they're offended by the use of the term Hindu because it's a colonial term that was given to them, and it's not the original way that they would have described themselves. Nonetheless, I'm going to use the term because we're used to that and I don't know Sanskrit.
Nor do we.
Right. Okay, so the roots are 2500 to 1500 BCE, which means that Hinduism is as old as the pyramids and older than Athens and Rome. Most Hindus live in India. 4 out of 5 people in India are Hindu, but it's also in Indonesia, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Malaysia, and of course, the United States. This is the 3rd largest religion after Christianity and Islam, which means there are 900 million Hindus, making up about 15% of the world's population. The earliest form of what we now call Hinduism is Vedic religion, which is a karma or action yoga path that comes from ancient ritual manuals called the Vedas, which is why this is called Vedic religion. Veda just means knowledge. The Vedas are regarded as eternal Sanskrit texts revealed to human beings through rishis, or who are seers, and they were compiled by a sage. The Vedas refer to 4 books. I think we have them listed here. And they include technical manuals for priests to perform rituals, but they also include philosophical dialogues. The most important Vedic gods are Agni and Indra. You can see them here. Agni is the god of fire. He is associated with sacrifice and the sun, the sacred cow, inner fire in the belly, and he is a messenger between heaven and earth, a god of hearth and home. Indra is the god of war. I don't know if you can see that. This one is Indra, the god of war and weather. He's a warrior, he's fearless and reckless, and he is the father of the warrior Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but I'm sure you've heard of the Bhagavad Gita. A second branch of Hinduism is philosophical Hinduism. This is a wisdom path, or jnana, yoga path of wandering renouncers, and their scriptures are the Upanishads. The Upanishads are sacred doctrines that include philosophical dialogues that speculate on the meaning of rituals and the ultimate reality that underlies them. So the Upanishads teach that we are essentially spiritual. We are unchanging, eternal souls, trapped in bodies. We inhabit bodies, which means that we will suffer in the cycle of life, death, and rebirth that is fueled by karma. And karma is just moral action and its consequences. In the Upanishads, the essence of humanity, this eternal soul, is the essence of divinity. So self and divinity are one, are equivalent. They are uncreated, deathless, and immortal. So the goal in this form of Hinduism is to experience the self and the divine equivalence. Those associated with philosophical Hinduism are renouncers, they're mystics, often homeless, celibate. They beg for food and they smash social taboos to experience mystical reality of this non-dual awareness, the awareness that all things are one. Functionally, philosophical Hindus are atheistic. So the gods exist, but they're largely irrelevant to the task at hand. A third branch of Hinduism is devotional Hinduism. It's a bhakti yoga that's found in the Hindu epics. So this branch begins around 0 CE and uses vernacular language rather than Sanskrit. It emphasizes narrative, gods, and personal divinities. And its signature texts are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana epics. The Mahabharata was composed between 400 BCE and 400 CE, and it has over 100,000 verses. Duty is its central occupation. It tells the story of a family feud over land. The most beloved portion of the text is the Bhagavad Gita, which means sacred song. And that is a dialogue on the ethics of war. It's focused on dharma or duty. It can be translated duty or law, justice, virtue. And so in the story, Arjuna, the warrior, talks to Krishna, who's in disguise. Krishna's a god, who tells Arjuna, the warrior, to fight. That's the dharma. That's his duty, is to fight. But he's supposed to do this without attachment to the outcome. And that's the philosophical portion of the tradition. So Krishna then lays out 3 paths to moksha, which is the goal, release from the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And the 3 paths include ritual and ethical action, which we already saw in Vedic religion, renunciation and wisdom, which we see in philosophical Hinduism, and then bhakti yoga of love and grace, which is what we get in devotional Hinduism. The Ramayana was composed between 200 BCE and 200 CE. It is on the ethics of marriage, and it has 24,000 verses. For reference, that's about 2 times the size of the New Testament. It's the story of the life and trials of a prince named Rama and his wife Sita. It's actually one of the 4 most influential books ever written, along with the Bible, the Quran, the Analects of Confucius, and then this book, because it is revered not only by Hindus, but it's also revered by Jains and Buddhists and Muslims. Diwali celebrates Rama's return to rule the kingdom. So Diwali, if you know, is the story of Diwali, and it's talking about Rama and Sita. So his return to rule the kingdom. Devotional Hinduism has 3 main gods, Shiva, Vishnu, and Mahadevi or Shakti, the great goddess. And so there are 3 main groups of people who worship each one. We have those who worship Vishnu are part of Vaishnavism. Vishnu has 10 avatars or 10 incarnations, and they include Rama, Krishna, the Buddha, Kalki, and others. Krishna, I think I have Krishna up here. Well, I've got Vishnu. Sorry, they're related. Krishna is best known as mischievous. He's a good god, but he's also a trickster. He has erotic encounters with cowherd girls called gopis. He has deep blue or black skin, and he is the hero in the Mahabharata as Krishna, and he's the hero in the Ramayana as Rama. So Vishnu, but then there's 10 different incarnations of Vishnu. So there's lots of different names to keep in mind when we're talking about Hinduism. Then we have worship of Shiva, or Shaivism. Shiva is the destroyer. I do have Shiva there in the middle. Shiva is the destroyer, the inheritor of the powers of the Vedic god Rudra, whose third eye can turn anything into dust. Shiva is both wrathful and loving, male and female, solitary and a lover. This god is depicted as a multi-armed dancer named Nataraj. And Shiva is associated with Varanasi, which is the sacred center in North India. Then we have those who worship Shakti, the great goddess. Shakti is considered mild when she is talked about as the consort of another god. So she's Parvati as the consort of Shiva. She's Radha as the consort of Krishna. She is Sita, the consort of Rama. Lakshmi, often paired with Vishnu. But then she's also seen as wild, not so mild, when she appears as Kali, the goddess of cremation and battlefields, or Durga, who I have here, who is fierce for righteousness. The Tantric tradition also worships Shakti. And this branch is powerful in India, Tibet, Nepal, and East and South Asia. So devotional Hinduism is a more egalitarian form of Hinduism than the philosophical or the Vedic traditions, because anybody can practice it. It addresses this worldly concerns, and the point is to prosper within the world. This form spread in the 7th century in southern India and in the 12th century in northern India, and it is now the most popular form of Hinduism. Practices include pilgrimages, festivals, and practice is much more important than doctrine. The primary ritual practice in devotional Hinduism is puja, which is a food offering. This modern form of Hinduism dates from the 19th century. It is primarily a response to British and American criticisms of Hinduism as idolatrous and polytheistic. So people started when colonialism got going and they went over to India and they saw all this stuff. They said, these people are so idolatrous and they've got all these gods and it's, primitive. They believe that the gods are actually in the statues or whatever. And so to respond and to become more respectable, to assimilate to colonial power, then they started to emphasize monotheism. And they even started to bend devotional Hinduism into monotheism by using the Upanishads and the philosophical tradition that talks about divinity rather than personal gods that you might have in your home or in the temple. So some of the why is lost in the very ancient period because we just don't have the resources to know exactly why did Vedic religion become philosophical. People just thought about it more, I guess, So some of it is hard to answer. But we know that they were responding to something because we can see it happening today. So they are bringing Hinduism into conversation with the Enlightenment, and I already said they're focusing on the philosophical Hinduism. All right, so we get to the nutshell version. The problem for Hindus is samsara, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Reincarnation is a continuation of unsatisfactoriness. So this is a cycle that Hindus want to get out of. The solution is moksha, or spiritual release or liberation. And this is the ultimate aim in life. But there are 3 other aims, and they include kama, which is sensual pleasure, artha, which is wealth and power, and dharma, which is duty. So there would be intra-life sort of goals, and then an ultimate goal, which would be to achieve release from this whole cycle. And then we saw the 3 techniques already. We've got karma yoga, which is an action yoga. Yoga means discipline, so it's an action tradition, wisdom tradition, and devotion. Those are the 3 ways to achieve moksha. And their exemplars are going to be priests in the Vedic tradition, mystics in the philosophical tradition, and then yogis and swamis in the devotional tradition. So, what I'd like for you to do now is turn to a neighbor. You don't have to answer all these questions. We've only got 5 minutes, but pick one. Pick one of these questions that you would like to answer with your neighbor, just between the 2 of you or the 3 of you. What surprises you about what you just heard about Hinduism? What confuses you? What do you admire about this religion? What similarities do you see between this religion and your own, if you have a religious tradition? And what differences do you see between this religion and your own? So Buddhism. Buddha means awakened one or enlightened one. And Siddhartha Gautama lived in the 6th century. He was the sort of founder of Buddhism. It starts in Nepal and India, and then it moves to South and East Asia. There are about 445 million adherents, which makes Buddhism the 4th largest religion in the world. It's 7% of the world population. So the history of Buddhism begins with Siddhartha Gautama, who started on the path to awakening as a sheltered prince in southern Nepal. He sees suffering in the world one day and becomes a wandering holy person in North India. He studied with various yogis. So he was in a Hindu culture, Hindu religion. He experimented with various bodily austerities. We were just talking about what we know as yoga, these positions one might get into in order to achieve an awakened state. And he otherwise searched for a solution to the problem of human suffering. He sat down at 35 years old under a tree in North India, and after 49 days, awakening came upon him. And what he saw were the 4 noble truths. Life is suffering. Suffering has an origin. Suffering can be eliminated, and we can eliminate suffering through the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So I already briefly mentioned the relation to Hinduism. Buddhism came out of Hinduism, and Buddhists disagree with Hindus about humanity. So for Buddhists, the self or the I does not exist. Remember that for Hindus, the goal is to achieve an equivalence between the I and the divine. But Buddhists think there is no I. I is a conventional name for 5 separate parts of what we take to be the self, which are always in ever-changing combinations: matter, sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness. So like Hindus, Buddhists trace the human problem to the karma-filled cycle of life, death, and rebirth, called samsara. But Buddhists are more explicit about why it's undesirable to wander from birth to birth. And that explicit thing is suffering. Life is suffering. The earliest form of Buddhism is Theravada Buddhism, which is popular in South and Southeast Asia. You can think of Thailand and Myanmar, Sri Lanka and Cambodia. This is a monastic form of Buddhism that requires withdrawal from the world. They hold that one can achieve nirvana, which is enlightenment, only through their own merit. For them, Buddha is a human pathfinder. People who are not monks then get merit from monks by giving them food and clothing. So this is the oldest form, monastic tradition, and monks devote their entire lives to achieving enlightenment. And then the people engage in Buddhism by giving food or other gifts to the monks. The second and largest form of Buddhism is Mahayana, which dominates in Vietnam and East Asian countries like China and Japan and Korea. This is a devotional form of Buddhism. So just like there was a devotional form of Hinduism, we have here a devotional form of Buddhism. Practitioners here see the Buddha as eternal and omniscient, someone who can answer prayers. This form of Buddhism championed a new exemplar called the Bodhisattva, a person who finds enlightenment and then uses their merit to help others. So unlike the monastic version where each person must for themselves get enlightenment, in the devotional form, bodhisattvas can help you. In this form of Buddhism, there are many Buddhas, not just the historical Buddha. And it's important to note that although Westerners typically associate Buddhism with meditation, most Buddhists don't meditate. Their piety consists in devotion to various Buddhas and other supramundane figures. We could call them deities or gods or powers. They worship Buddhas in temples, they pray to them at home, they go on pilgrimage to sacred sites associated with the exploits of the Buddhas, and they carry out funeral rites. So some names here would be Pure Land Buddhism, True Pure Land Buddhism, Lotus Sutra schools. You may have seen Soka Gakkai International. That's like a brand. They sell things here in the United States. They're related to the Lotus Sutra schools. Zen is a meditation school, and all of those are part of this kind of Buddhism. Okay, Vajrayana Buddhism. This is practiced in Tibet, and it has a presence in Mongolia, Bhutan, Nepal, Russia, and parts of China, Japan, and India. It's the smallest form of Buddhism, and it developed out of Mahayana in India in the 6th century. It combines Theravada monasticism, the study of Mahayana texts, and the magical and ritualistic traditions of Tantra, something we didn't talk about, but it's another form of Buddhism. And then shamanistic beliefs and practices of the indigenous Bon religion. So in Vajrayana Buddhism, one can achieve Buddhahood in one lifetime. That's what makes this distinctive. They use mantras, they revere the Lama, the guru, or what we would call the teacher, and practices are transmitted from teacher to student. They use the Tibetan Book of the Dead to guide the soul between death and rebirth. So that's something you may have heard about. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is part of Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet. So there are 3 refuges or 3 jewels in Buddhism, and this is how you can convert by saying these words. Obviously, it's not that easy. But people say, I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma, which is, again, duty, the duty to know things as they are. I take refuge in the Sangha, or the community. So these are like 3 touch points of Buddhist tradition. You have to have the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So in a nutshell, the problem in Buddhism is suffering, not just unsatisfactoriness, but suffering. Suffering is caused by ignorant craving, by the tendency to mistake changing things for unchanging things, or clinging to unchangeability. The solution is nirvana, this extinguishing of suffering, and the technique is the Eightfold Path, and of course the various methods that each form of Buddhism offers. Exemplars would be the historical Buddha, other Buddhas, monks, and bodhisattvas. 5 minutes, my friends. What surprises you? What confuses you? What do you admire? What similarities do you see? What differences do you see? Judaism. So here we might be in more familiar territory a little bit. So Judaism originates in what I'm going to call the Southern Levant. This is a term that's used by historians that avoids our modern terms for the region because it's had so many different names over the years. The ancient roots of the religion are 2500 to 1500 BCE, and practitioners live in Israel. There's 4.9 million folks in Israel, and in the US there are 5.2 million. So it might be a surprise to notice that there's slightly more Jewish folks in the US than in the state of Israel. But of course there are many ethnic groups in the Jewish community. Ashkenazi Jews of German and Eastern European descent are the majority. There are also Sephardic Jews of Spanish and Arab descent, and then Ethiopian Jews of African descent. It is the smallest of the religions. There are about 14 million Jews worldwide, but as you know, they have an outsourced influence in all of our religious traditions. So even though they're small, they're very mighty. So ancient Judaism, we begin with biblical Judaism, begins around 1500 BCE as a priestly tradition focused on sacrifice and devotion to Yahweh, the God of the tribe of Judah and Israel. Early Jewish folks were henotheists. That might be a new word for you. Henotheist means that they acknowledge the existence of other gods, but worship the one God of Israel. So they acknowledge the existence of other gods, but worshipped just one. The history of Judaism includes a series of disputes over this very important land in the southern Levant of West Asia. So a lot of the history and the development of Judaism occurs because of these conquests and people being deported and coming back and that sort of thing. So I have lots of dates and people up here. We'll go very quickly through them. First, we have the Assyrian conquest, and then the Babylonian. The Babylonian conquest is special because the first Jerusalem temple was destroyed in this conquest, and the people were sent into Babylonian exile, which is modern-day Iraq. And so this is the period where the synagogue was developed as a place of prayer and study, the Jerusalem temple having been destroyed. This period also saw the widespread adoption of circumcision and an emphasis on monotheism as opposed to henotheism. So here as the Jewish people are thrust into a new people group and they find themselves without a temple, they develop ways to distinguish themselves from others and to find a new way to worship. In 538 BCE, the people returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple because the Persians had then defeated the Babylonians, and so the Jewish folks were allowed to come back. Beginning in 332 BCE, the area was dominated by Hellenistic rulers, and in 167, the Maccabees revolted against Greek domination, and in 164 they captured Jerusalem and restored temple worship, and this is commemorated with Hanukkah. So I mentioned the story for that purpose. In 64 CE, the area was conquered by the Romans. There was a Jewish-Roman war from 66 to 73 because of the very repressive rule of Roman governors. In 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, and they sent the people into exile, and this turned the Jewish community definitively into a people of the book rather than a people of the temple. The figure of the Messiah becomes prominent in the Talmud, which was, this will be in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, and the people begin to hope for a king to end the exile. There was one particular event called the Bar Kokhba Revolt that happened in 132 CE, and this was in order to try to end the exile. There was a revolt, and many Jews were killed or exiled or sold into slavery. In the 7th century, an Arab army conquered the area and built the Dome of the Rock on the site of the Jerusalem Temple. The Arab Empire grew in the 8th century. And then from the 11th to the 13th centuries, the area was a battlefield between European Christians and Arab Muslims during the Crusades, wherein Christians also tried to claim the land. It was also besieged by Egyptian warriors of Turkish origin, and they ruled from the 13th century to the 16th century. Then we have the Turkish Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. Jews started repopulating the area at that time, especially into the 19th century when anti-Semitism was growing in Europe. In 1897, Jewish people offered their first political push for a Jewish homeland that would be recognized as a modern state. And the Ottoman Empire then began to persecute and expel Jews. Britain conquered the area in 1918, and Jews came back, relocated to the area again. Then from 1933 to 1945, Jewish people, as you know, were systematically persecuted and murdered by Nazi Germans under Adolf Hitler, and also its allies and collaborators, Italy, Japan, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Croatia, what we know as the Axis powers, killing 6 million European Jews, which was about 1/3 of the global population.
You left out the Russians.
Oh, did I? Russians. State of Israel was founded in 1948, and of course we know that the battles are still raging. So there are 4 major branches of the modern Jewish family. There's actually more, but we're skipping them for time. So Orthodox Judaism will be the first. 21% of U.S. Jews who belong to a synagogue are Orthodox. They focus on the law. They are the defenders of Torah and tradition. So you'll see here male rabbis, kosher diets, services in Hebrew, wearing yarmulkes. Men and women would be segregated in shul, and they would wear the fringes. There are 2 subtypes, modern Orthodox, represented by Yeshiva University, and then Hasidism, the ultra-Orthodox, which began in the 1730s in Eastern Europe, and they focus on divine immanence and the heart over the head. Conservative Judaism is the next. This will be 33% of U.S. Jews. They focus on tradition. They're open to advances in modern thought, including biblical criticism. They're closer to the Orthodox on worship and law because they respect ritual commands and they worship in Hebrew. But women and LGBTQ people can be ordained, and worshipers can drive to services on the Sabbath, for instance. They originated in 1886 in New York City and founded the Jewish Theological Seminary. Reform Judaism began in the 18th century in Europe, now represented by Hebrew Union College. 39% of U.S. Jews are Reform. And for many, the essence of Judaism here is the Golden Rule. So there's a focus on ethics, and there's an impulse toward integration or assimilation, and so they use the vernacular language in sermons and prayers rather than Hebrew. So they use the language of the people that are in the congregation. And men and women can sit together in this form. Reconstructionist Judaism is an American branch developed by Mordecai Kaplan. They have Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia, founded in 1968. They reject the notion of the Jews as a chosen people, and they speak of God as the expression of the highest ethical ideals of humans. They are more traditional and observant than Reform Jews in general. They use Hebrew in worship services. They observe holy days, but they view mitzvot or commands as folkways rather than law. So it's a cultural way of the community rather than a divine command. We're skipping Kabbalah and we're skipping humanist Judaism. Those are also smaller branches, but they do exist. But we've only got so much time. So in a nutshell, for Jewish folks, the problem is disobedience and forgetfulness of the one God. The solution is obedience and remembrance of God's commands. And the technique is to learn Torah and Talmud, to tell the story, to follow the law, to repair the world. Exemplars will be rabbis and other important historical figures. 5 minutes. Here's the questions. Okay, so Christianity. Early Christians were Jews and God-fearing Gentiles, which means non-Jews, who believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the anointed one. The Messiah or the Christ just means anointed one, who would bring the reign of God to earth. So it originated in the 1st century CE, again in the Levant, Mediterranean, North Africa. And we've got about 2.2 billion people who are Christians, 1/3 of the world's population. Christianity is the majority religion in Europe, Australia, North and South America, and 120 other countries. So the basic story of Christianity and its origins comes from the appearance of Jesus of Nazareth. He was a Jew who lived in Nazareth, as you might imagine, at the beginning of the 1st century, and he claimed that he was the anointed one. Other anointed people before Jesus in the Jewish tradition included high priests, prophets, and kings. The Spirit of God was seen to be present in these people, and so Jesus claimed to be the anointed one because he saw himself bringing good news to poor and oppressed Jewish people, since they were living under the repressive rule of Greek and Roman authorities at the time. The good news, as Jesus proclaimed it, was that God loves the poor, those who mourn, those who are meek, the hungry and the thirsty, the merciful, the pure in heart, peacemakers, and the persecuted. He talked with and cared for women and children, tax collectors, and other sinners. He preached the love of God and neighbor, non-judgment, and the forgiveness of others. On the other hand, he warned the rich, the well-fed, and those who pride themselves on their reputation. He also criticized his own Jewish religious authorities for caring more about tradition and outward appearances than about people's needs and about their hearts. So he was seen as a healer, a prophet, and a teacher. There are 3 major branches that we'll include. The Orthodox Church is the eastern portion of the Christian church. We find them originally in the Mediterranean, Europe, and in the Middle East. They broke from the previously united Eastern-Western Church in 1054 over political, cultural, and theological disputes. And the Orthodox Church spoke Greek, and the Greek part still does. The Orthodox Church does not have one leader, but it has many regions and patriarchs who are over those regions, and Constantinople has pride of place among the regions. Then we have the Roman Catholic Church. This is the western part of the church in the early days. In the Mediterranean, in Europe and North Africa, they spoke Latin instead of Greek. And the Roman Catholic Church has one primary leader, who we know as the Pope, and then several others who are related hierarchically to one another. Third, we have Protestant churches. Protestants originated in the Roman Catholic Church, and Martin Luther is the most well-known of those who originally intended only to reform the Western Church, but he was excommunicated primarily because of allegations of the church's economic exploitation of the poor, and he emphasized the authority of the Bible over tradition, faith over works, and grace. There's no primary leader in the Protestant churches, but there are many traditions that have their own ways of organizing themselves. Lutheran churches originated from Luther, Martin Luther. Reformed churches originating from Calvin and Zwingli and others. Presbyterian Church, or my own tradition, the United Church of Christ, are Reformed. Then we have a sort of branch of Anglican and Episcopal churches. The Wesleyan and Methodist churches came out of that, and Pentecostals came out of that. And then we have free churches, including Baptists, Quakers, Anabaptists, Mennonites, those sorts of traditions. And all of them are Protestant. There are some distinctive beliefs and practices of Christians. I'm going to give you the 2 or 3 most important ones. The doctrine of the Trinity. So Christians believe that God is one, but God has 3 relational external distinctions. So God is related to the universe as creator. God is related to humanity and the earth as redeemer. And God is related to the church as sustainer or comforter. And then God also has 3 internal distinctions. And this is conceived in different ways. So God is related to God's self internally as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Or some might say God is love, wisdom, and power. Or God is revealer, revealing, revealed. There's a lot of different 3s that are used for these internal distinctions, although Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is the most popular. Then we have the doctrine of Christ. Christians believe that Jesus is fully human, and they also believe that he is indwelt by the Spirit of God. So Jesus is an incarnation or an embodiment of God. And then practices will include baptism and confirmation, which is an entrance into the Christian community, a rite of initiation. And then communion, which is a ritual meal of bread and wine or juice, recalling Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples at Passover. So you can see the Jewish translation. In a nutshell, Christians believe that humans are separated from God and others. The solution is union or communion with God and others through Christ. The technique is different. Conservatives will typically say that the technique is that one must accept that Jesus' death unites people to God. And a more progressive view would be that the technique, what you need to do is join a community in which the Spirit of Jesus is alive and become transformed by that Spirit. Exemplars include biblical figures, historical Christian figures, Jesus, saints, and so on. Let's see what you make of that. All right, so we move on to Islam. This is our last one, and then we get to do a comparison. So Islam, the word just means submission to Allah, and Allah is just the word for God, so submission to God. It began in the 7th century CE and originated in Mecca and Medina. 1/5 of the world's population are Muslim, and so that's the second largest religion, second to Christianity. Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the founder of Islam. He was born in 570 and died in 632. He was a human being born in Mecca, and he was orphaned as a child. At 40 years old, he was a merchant, and he was married to Khadijah at the time of his first revelation. Angel Gabriel commands him to recite, and that's what the word Quran means, is to recite. He received these revelations from 610 to 632, and so these revelations became the Quran. So Muhammad was a charismatic and bureaucratic leader. He was a prophet and a model. He was also a military leader. He had 9 wives. He led armies and ruled an empire that covered most of the Arabian Peninsula. The community around him was founded in 622, and he and his followers emigrated from Mecca to Medina, and this marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. The relation between Judaism and Christianity, sorry, I got confused. So Muslims believe that the Torah and the Gospels were revealed by Allah through prophets, but they were corrupted. Only the Quran is perfectly preserved. The Quran includes almost no stories. It's doctrinal and legal, but it does have figures like Mary and Jesus in it, but it's not stories. There are 114 surahs or chapters that are presented by length, from the longest to the shortest. The Quran is written in the Arabic language, and it is seen as perfect and unalterable and untranslatable, as opposed to, for instance, Christian scriptures. We tend to think you can basically understand it, and it's still the Word of God, even if it's in English, rather than whatever language we're talking about, Greek or Hebrew. The Quran is analogous to Jesus in Christianity. If we want to make a comparison, the Word of God, what Christians think of as Jesus, is how Muslims think of the Quran. The Word of God in the world, recited to his companions. And it wasn't written down until after Muhammad's death. So the Quran is scripture only in Arabic, not in other languages. But interestingly, only 20% of the world's Muslims can read it. So it's more recited than it is read. There are 2 major branches in Islam, Sunni and Shia. These two split in 632 after Muhammad's death over his successor, who was going to come and be the leader after Muhammad's death. The Sunnis, the name Sunnah just means tradition. They're 85% of the population, and they saw Muhammad's father-in-law as Muhammad's rightful successor. The Sunnis decentralize religious authority into the community as a whole, and they invest social and political authority in a series of caliphs. So the important thing is that they separate religious authority from political authority. Shias are the next group. This is only 15% of Muslims, and they saw Muhammad's son-in-law as Muhammad's successor. They centralize religious, social, and political authority in the imam. And in this tradition, the imam must descend from Muhammad, and they are sinless and infallible. There are various versions of that too, which we're skipping, but different kinds of Shiites exist as well. The 5 pillars of Islam might be familiar to you. This is a usual way of summarizing what's important in Islam. The Shahada, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Salat, or prayer, which is done 5 times a day by observant Muslims. The zakat, or charity, they give 2.5% of assets above subsistence level. Fasting during Ramadan, which you may be familiar with, and then the pilgrimage to Mecca. Once in one's lifetime, a Muslim is supposed to go to Mecca, and that's what you see on the screen there. This pilgrimage reinforces the unity of Muslims. Men wear white, and they're praying there at the Kaaba shrine. The shrine is believed to have been built by Abraham, and it houses a black stone, which is believed to be a meteor. Allah is obviously very important. Muslims strongly emphasize divine oneness or monotheism, and God is seen as totally transcendent. So God cannot incarnate, but God has many names. The gravest mistake is any practice or belief that ignores the unity and the uniqueness of God. So polytheism, idolatry, for instance, Jesus as the Son of God, the Trinity, all of these things are rejected. In a nutshell, the problem is pride, believing that you are self-sufficient without Allah, or forgetting your own true nature as one who is dependent. The solution is to obey or to submit to Allah, humility. So you think of the prostrations that are involved in the practicing the religion. And the technique will be those 5 pillars. That's how you attain the solution. And the exemplars will be Muhammad and imams and other religious leaders. All right. A few minutes to discuss. So what I have for you as a parting gift is this chart. This is the most interesting part of what we could do today. So if I were still a professor, I would give you homework. Read this and then do some good comparing, because I think now that you've seen the sort of overview, you can go back and see, okay, now how do they all relate to one another, and where do we see similarities, and where are they totally different, and who's reacting to who, and all of that kind of stuff. So I encourage you to keep thinking about it. And thanks again for this invitation to be here. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.